Alright, city heads, I have something very Christmassy for you, which is a bar chart race that I've made that shows the growth of the UK's largest cities over the last 2,000 years from the Roman era right up until present day, so let's just get straight into it. So we start here in the 1st century AD, right at the beginning of Roman rule in Britain. Now, Roman Britain is mostly rural with a few small cities and towns here and there, and at this point in the timeline, Colchester is the capital city. But the whole province is an outpost compared to the rest of the Roman Empire, and most of the cities shown here are no larger than what we would call villages in the modern era. Here's a picture of what London looked like in the year AD 40. It's no more than a village with a few huts. But Boudicca attacks Colchester in 60 AD, totally destroying the city, and at that point the capital of Roman Britain becomes London, and as a result, as you can see from the chart, London starts to grow rapidly in population, and it passes 20,000 before we enter the 2nd century. Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall are built during the 2nd century AD at some point, and at the time that those two walls are built, you can already see that London is by far the largest city. Now, I want to be clear at this point that these population figures are all very rough estimates. The first proper census in the UK was conducted in 1801. We had the Domesday Book in 1086, which was sort of a medieval census, and I took some of these figures from poll tax records throughout history. But by and large, a lot of these early population figures are gathered from someone just rocking up in a town, counting the number of houses, and making a kind of rough estimation on the population of that town based on that. I basically gathered as many of these population data points as I could for each town throughout history and used Excel to sort of fill in the gaps. And there you go, London is just kind of racing ahead there, 30,000 by the middle of the 2nd century. And all of these cities are growing really, really fast in the first few centuries of Roman rule. And it's around this era that the Romans start building stone walls around some towns, including St Albans in 273 AD, which kind of indicates that these towns are now growing in significance. And there's York, you can see that very much overtaking St Albans. And London and York are kind of designated provincial capitals of Roman Britain around this year. So London in the south and York in the north. So York begins to grow really, really rapidly as we enter the middle of the 3rd century. And throughout a lot of UK history, we do see that York tends to be the 2nd city of the UK throughout the Roman era, and then also throughout the Viking era, as we'll see in a bit. But as we enter the 4th century, Roman rule in Britain begins to collapse. With the rest of the empire falling into collapse, they don't have as many resources to keep the Roman province under control. And from the 4th century onwards, slowly but surely, urban populations in the UK begin to dissipate. So London's population hits a peak of 40,000 towards the end of the 3rd century, and after that, it begins its slow decline. You can see here all of these Roman cities are beginning to dissipate and move out into the surrounding countryside as British society becomes more agrarian once the Romans leave. And the Romans leave Britain entirely by about 410 AD, and that marks the beginning of the sub-Roman era. And cities are slowly abandoned as society becomes more agrarian. And many cities are left totally depopulated or abandoned in many cases. And you can just see that happening as the years roll on. These cities are beginning to wither away, fading into insignificance as everybody moves out into the countryside and cities just become less and less important overall. And there's London totally collapsing. York becomes the largest city very briefly, but overall all of these populations are just totally fading away. London back down to 5,000 people, and many cities in this era, in the 5th century, are basically just rural settlements sitting within increasingly derelict Roman walls. Even London is totally abandoned, but you still have some rural communities living within the old Roman walls. So we had this illustration a minute ago showing London in 40 AD. This series is by a guy called Ivan Hopper. I found him on Reddit literally just the other day, and it's quite interesting because he illustrates London throughout different eras of its life. So here it is in 40 AD, here it is in 200 AD, you remember when the population was around 40k, 30k to 40k, and yeah, here it is in 400 AD. So you can see there's just these little rural settlements with a sort of a farm there, all sat within the old Roman wall. And as we head into the middle of the 5th century, these cities are really no more than what we would call towns nowadays. London's population falling below 4,000 there. And the beginning of the the Anglo-Saxon era saw cities shrink even further as the population fully dispersed into the countryside. It's at this point though that Winchester becomes the sort of capital of the Kingdom of Wessex, which is developing in that area of the country, and that sees some growth which sort of bucks the trend, but overall cities and urban life in the UK withers away into nothing as we head into the 6th century. So there's Winchester becoming the sort of the largest city in the UK. I mean, again, I say city, it had under 3,000 people in population, so it wasn't very much at all. And interestingly, in this era as well, Canterbury also continues to grow because it becomes a sort of a religious centre and apparently a sort of a pilgrimage site. So that sees some growth as well. And it's interesting, throughout a lot of these next few centuries, London is actually relegated to 2nd or even 3rd largest city in the UK, 4th in the middle of the 6th century, as we can see here. Canterbury, the largest city in the 6th century for a bit. As I said, it becomes a bit of a pilgrimage site, a bit of a religious site. I guess that's where like the Archbishop of Canterbury and stuff comes from. Yeah, I will caveat all of this by saying I'm not a historian. I've managed to piece together as much of this as possible, but some of it might be prone to inaccuracies, so sorry about that. And York begins to grow quite quickly again in the 7th century, as you can see here, overtaking Canterbury. London, the 3rd largest city in the UK, which is weird to think of in modern era. And after several hundred years of decline, after the Romans left, we are beginning to see these cities start to grow again. And that's because we start to see the emergence of market towns. So as we become more agrarian, we start living off the land a bit more, there is still a bit of a need to trade agricultural goods. And the best places to do that are cities. And in a lot of cases, they use the old Roman infrastructure, the old kind of Roman roads, which also happen to converge on the old Roman cities. So they just become very convenient places to host weekly or monthly markets, which kick-start the urban revolution again in the UK in the sort of the 7th century. So we do start to see some very, very small growth happening in these cities hundreds of years after the Romans left. So yeah, York growing relatively rapidly there, Canterbury still continuing its growth as well, in London, and they're all sort of growing at a relatively fast rate as they start to emerge as kind of market towns and sort of centres of their local agricultural regions. And there we are, we're in the 8th century now, and yeah, the cities are just growing at quite a slow rate, but ultimately growing, unlike in the sort of the sub-Roman era where these cities were just sort of dissipating into nothing. And London is once again the 2nd largest city here, and very much growing at about the same pace as York. And I want to bring attention at this point to the sort of the canvas of blue on the bar chart here, which represents southern England. So you can see I've got a key at the bottom there that I've sort of coloured each city based on where in the UK it is, and dark blue represents southern England. And there is a huge dominance of blue across this chart, which basically just shows that any sort of urban society in this era, in the 8th century, was mostly located in southern England. There's a few Midland England cities like Lincoln and Leicester and Lichfield, and obviously York is the sort of the largest city in the country, that's in northern England, but really by and large the largest sort of cities in the UK in this era were all in southern England. And York's population approaching 10,000 there as we head into the 9th century, and London's population growing at about the same rate, but again, just all very, very small cities and very, very small amounts of growth compared to what will come later as we hit the Industrial Revolution. And in 843 we see the beginning of the Kingdom of Scotland, so we might start to see some Scottish cities appearing on the chart relatively soon. And there we go, London, as we approach the 10th century, is very much beginning to accelerate beyond York. And in 866 the Vikings conquer northern England and York becomes the Viking capital of England. Now in 886 London is refortified by King Alfred, it becomes a major trading port and political centre, and the population of the city begins to rapidly expand. And I think this is the last time that London isn't the largest city in the UK anymore. It overtakes York, and then it retains the title of the UK's second city until the modern era. So York kind of goes into a bit of stagnation after the Viking invasion, but still York and London are still very much the largest cities in the UK at this point. So London's population is approaching 15,000 in this era. York's population is expanding as well, but all of these cities are expanding quite rapidly now compared to where they were a few hundred years ago. But even though these cities are now expanding quite rapidly again as we approach the second millennium, they're still only less than half the size they were 800 years previously under Roman rule. You remember London's population at the peak of Roman rule was about 40,000. It's now just shy of 20,000. So over the last 800 years, these cities have barely advanced. And there we are in the second millennium now. The year now has 4 digits instead of 3. And London's population has just exceeded 20,000. We see York's population falling back slightly. We're now up to 1066, which is the Battle of Hastings, which was won by William the Conqueror, and that marks the beginning of the Norman era in England. And we really start to see London's population, London's dominance, extend throughout this era. After the Battle of Hastings, we also get the harrying of the north, and York is largely destroyed with the capital city returned to London. So we'll start to see York decline over the next few years. And that gap between London and the other cities expands even wider. And in 1110, the White Tower at the Tower of London, the iconic sort of Tower of London that we all recognise from today, is built as the city's walls are further refortified, and that really reflects how London's importance was growing in this era. So there it is in 1240, this is from Ivan Lapper yet again. But yeah, you can see there's the White Tower. You have these really strong fortified walls now along the river with a bit of a settlement growing within it, and there would have been just off to the left there would have been the sort of the actual town of London growing in size and significance now. We're now starting to see quite significant settlements forming in Winchester, Norwich, Lincoln, Exeter, all of these places. And London's population is growing rapidly. It's about to hit 30,000, but even 1,000 years later, London's population still hasn't returned to the population that it had at its Roman peak. In 1215, King John of England ratifies the Magna Carta, so around about the time that the Magna Carta was ratified, London's population was 35,000, and this is how the largest cities in the UK looked. We've just had Edinburgh pop up at the bottom of the screen there, and yeah, that's going to be one to watch over the next few years. And in about the middle of the 13th century, London finally returns to the population that it had during the peak of Roman rule, 40,000 people. So it took 1,000 years for London's population to go from its previous Roman peak, to go through all of that decline, and then to get back to where it was under its previous Roman peak. And now it's on 50,000, so it's growing really rapidly now as we enter the 14th century. And there's Edinburgh rising up the ranks, as I said, that's going to be one to watch. Oh, and Glasgow has just popped up there as well. Now we're about to get into the Black Death, which hits in 1348, and that's going to cause a lot of disruption to urban populations. There you go, you can see it there. And it'll take a lot of cities another century to return to their pre-plague populations. It killed up to half the population of York, and in many ways York never really recovered. It continues to decline for at least another few centuries. The Black Death really caused a bit of a shake-up in what were the largest cities in the UK. There's Norwich now, and Norwich will spend a century or two as Britain's second city. But you can see at this point, I want to bring attention to the gap that has formed between London and all of the other cities. I think this is the widest extent of the gap between London and the second and third and fourth cities. London is an absolute powerhouse, a massive city, one of the largest cities in Europe, certainly at this point, whereas the other cities in the UK, Norwich, York, Bristol, by modern standards, they'd only be considered small towns. A little bit more colour on the graph now. We've got a few reds representing Scotland, we've got a few purples representing Northern England, and we've got a few light blues. And it's around this time that we had the Wars of the Roses and that sort of stuff. In 1497, we get the discovery of North America, and London's population really begins to accelerate as we enter the 16th century. Henry VII, the 7th, is crowned King of England in 1485, and that marks the beginning of the Tudor era. And London's population there has hit 100,000 for the first time ever. In 1536, we get the Act of Union between England and Wales, and there's London's population heading towards 200,000, expanding really rapidly at this point. And actually, that gap between London and the other cities has widened even further than I thought it had previously. And we get a lot more colour now, so you can see Newcastle has appeared, Liverpool has appeared in northern England, so there's a lot more colour on the chart now than there was before. 1591, the first performance of a play by William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare was performing in a London that had 250,000 in population, which would have definitely been one of the largest cities in the world at this point. So now we're in 1603, King James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and that unites the crowns and marks the beginning of the Stuart era. London's population has just hit 300,000. It is an absolute behemoth. And it's around this time that we get the start of the English Civil War as well. And yeah, London's population heading towards 400,000. It'll be on about 500,000 pretty soon by the looks of it. 1652, tea arrives in Britain for the first time. And then we get the Great Plague of 1665, which does wipe out a lot of urban populations, but they're growing so fast at this point, especially London, that they very, very quickly recover. London's population there hits 500,000 as we head into the 18th century. Now, as London's population hits 500,000, we can see that Edinburgh has emerged as the second city. It's got a population of over 40,000 now, and it's growing quite rapidly during this era. Geographically, though, it's quite constrained, and so it's in Edinburgh that we begin to see some of the world's first tall buildings. These huge apartment blocks that are built to cram in as many people into the city as possible. In about 100 years, in the late 1700s, Edinburgh will begin to build the new town as a sort of an urban expansion, but until then, it becomes the densest city in Europe. And at this point, I've got to slow down the animation a little bit, because after this point, as we enter the 1700s, things start happening a lot quicker. So in 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain comes into being, and we're now entering the Georgian era, and we're now at the embryonic stage of the Industrial Revolution. So from here on in, we're going to start seeing cities in northern and midland England begin to expand rapidly. And there's Glasgow expanding really quickly. And the Industrial Revolution creates a period of unprecedented growth for British cities. And it's in this era that the US is starting to develop rapidly as well. So we're going to start to see cities on the west coast of the UK, places like Glasgow and Liverpool and Bristol, start to expand rapidly as new trade routes are opened up to the US. And there we go, London's population hits 1 million people, Glasgow is expanding rapidly, there comes Leeds right at the start of the Industrial Revolution, Liverpool is rising quickly as well, there comes Manchester, accelerating as we head into the sort of the 19th century. The United Kingdom is officially formed around about this era, and yeah, those cities are expanding really quickly. Remember, just about a century ago, we had London that had 300,000, and that was an absolute behemoth compared to all of the other cities in the UK. Now we have several cities that are all over 300,000 people, just like that. And that's what the beginning of the Industrial Revolution looked like for the UK. These cities were beginning to expand at a rapid pace. There's Manchester emerging as the second city from about the 1800s onwards. Glasgow is expanding rapidly because of those trade routes to the US, Liverpool as well, Bristol too. The world's first passenger railway opens between Stockton and Darlington in 1825, and that's then closely followed by the world's first intercity railway between Manchester and Liverpool in 1830. Manchester's population there hitting 750,000, Glasgow and Leeds both on 500,000 each, Birmingham expanding, Liverpool expanding really rapidly now. Queen Victoria ascends to the throne in 1837, that marks the beginning of the Victorian era. Manchester's population has hit 1 million, Glasgow not far behind. The 1860 census reveals that 20 million people in the UK live in cities, so we've gone from being a very agrarian society after the Romans left to being a predominantly urban society in the middle of the Victorian era. In 1863, the London Underground opens, and it serves a population of 3.4 million people in London. London, by far the largest city in the world at this point. So Birmingham's population hits 1 million, Liverpool's population hits 1 million. Education becomes compulsory for children under 10 around this era. So we're beginning to get into the sort of the modern era, really. There's Manchester's population on more than 2 million. And now the Victorian era ends in 1901 with the death of Queen Victoria, of course. And at that point, Manchester's population is approaching 2.5 million, Liverpool's is approaching 1.8 million, Birmingham on 1.6 million. The First World War between 1914 and 1918, and this is what the largest cities in the UK looked like at that point. Ireland gains independence from the UK in 1920, 1928. Women gain equal voting rights to men. And it's from this point onwards that we start to notice a bit of a slowdown. So Manchester's population, which was expanding rapidly just 50 years ago, is already starting to dip very slowly into decline. Other cities, London is still expanding, Birmingham is still expanding, these other cities are still expanding, just a bit slower than they were before. We get the Second World War in 1939, and it's really after the Second World War that urban populations begin to decline for the first time in hundreds of years, and that's because of post-war slum clearance and suburbanisation, which suddenly causes a bit of a shift in urban Britain. And it throws many cities into decline, slow decline at first, but then rapid decline as we head further into the post-war era. And you see the scale of the chart is beginning to shift left. As you can see, cities very much declining. Birmingham has overtaken Manchester to become the second city, and after the war, Birmingham was held up as the sort of the poster child of Britain's post-war revival. It was sort of the city of the future. And here we are all of a sudden in the 1990s, and urban populations have kind of hit their lowest level, their lowest post-war level. And it's at this point that we start to recognise actually urban decline isn't very good for us, as a country. So it's at that point that we start to put a little bit more money into urban renaissance, and these cities start to grow again slowly at first as we enter the 21st century, but it starts to occur a bit more rapidly as we head towards the modern day. And there we go, the cities are expanding again. London's population is approaching 9 million. There's a little bit of a hiccup there as the pandemic occurred. I don't know if you saw that, but yeah, there we go. So as of 2024, which is the latest data that we have, London's population is on 9 million. It got down as far as I think something like 6.6 million in the sort of the depths of the post-war era there. Birmingham and Manchester have actually, in 2024, they both hit 3 million at the same time. Liverpool on just under 2 million, Leeds on 1.3 million, Glasgow on 1 million. I want to reiterate that I'm using metropolitan data for this, so this isn't the sort of local authority data. London is Greater London, Birmingham is the West Midlands, Manchester is Greater Manchester, Liverpool is the Liverpool City region, Leeds is, I think, it's West Yorkshire minus Bradford. But yeah, there we are. They are Britain's largest metropolitan areas as they appear in 2024. Now, I had this enormous data set which took ages to put together. As I said earlier, I kind of... I gathered as many data points as possible from these different cities throughout time and then just kind of filled in the gaps on Excel. So I ended up with this enormous data set of like the population of the UK's cities over 2,000 years. And I thought, I can make some cool graphs out of that. So here is one which compares the size of London compared to the second city. We touched on it a bit in the video, especially throughout the kind of medieval era there, where London was like by far the largest city, like way bigger than Norwich and things like that. And you can see that here in this graph. For instance, in Roman London in the year 150 AD, London was 4 times larger than the next largest city, which at that point was St Albans. And then we move on to between 550 and 850 AD, where London was not the largest city in the UK. It was overtaken by Canterbury and then York. And York is like the first or second largest city in the UK for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A whole millennium out of the last 2,000 years, York has been either the second or third largest city in the UK, which is crazy to think of now because York is really quite small compared to a lot of other cities in the UK. We don't really think of York as being like the second city, but for half of the last 2,000 years, York was either the largest or the second largest city in the UK. And then between 1450 and 1550, Norwich was the second city, but of course it's at this point that London was by far larger than any other city in the UK, so 14 times larger than Norwich in 1550, almost 16 times larger than Edinburgh in 1650. And then as we enter the Industrial Revolution, the other cities, the second, third and fourth cities in the UK obviously started to grow and sort of close the gap with London a little bit more. So there is Glasgow in 1750, and then Manchester in 1850 and 1950. And then today in 2024, Birmingham is the second most populated city, but it's about 3 times smaller than London. So more in line with the gap that existed in the Roman era, really, where obviously London was 4 times larger than St Albans. Birmingham is now 3 times smaller than London. So it's some similar gap to the one that we had about 2,000 years ago. And then this graph shows the total population of the UK's 10 largest cities throughout time. So I've basically added up the populations of those 10 largest cities, and this is the result that we get. It's very much skewed because obviously since the Industrial Revolution, these cities have expanded massively. So today, for instance, there are 22.4 million people living in the UK's 10 largest cities, which means that today more people live in the UK's 10 largest cities than ever before. But then, yeah, in sort of 150, 250 AD, there was still only about 120,000 people living in our cities. It then dipped down to 17, 18,000 in 550 AD. And then you can see there, as the Industrial Revolution takes over, 1550, 1650, 1750, 1850, these cities grow rapidly until you get to 1950, when our cities were absolutely massive. Up to the year 2000, we had that kind of post-war depopulation. But then, as I mentioned when we were looking at the bar chart race, in the last 25 years or so, we've had this urban renaissance. More and more people have moved into the UK's cities than ever before. And similar to that previous graph here is the percentage of people living in the UK's 10 largest cities. So at the peak of Roman occupation in Britain, 6% of the population lived in the 10 largest cities. Hit a peak of 41.8% in 1950. So in 1950, 42% of people in the UK lived in those 10 largest cities. That fell to a modern low of about 28% in the year 2000, but has now risen once more to 32.4%. So we're on our way to about a third of the UK's population living in those 10 largest cities and their metropolitan areas. And that kind of squares with this sort of global trend that we're seeing, where more and more people are living in cities than ever before, and that's forecast to accelerate. And then lastly, I have this graph which shows annual population growth of the 10 largest cities. So between each year, what was the average rate of population growth throughout these 10 largest cities? And throughout the Roman era, the 10 largest cities were seeing population growth of about 500 people per annum. And then in the post-Roman era, that fell, and you saw people moving out of cities at a rate of about 300 to about 700 people per year. And then it kind of just plodded along for about a millennium up to 1450, and then obviously you see the growth there of the Industrial Revolution. So about 7,200 people per year moving into cities in 1750. That grew to 60,000 in 1850, 137,000 throughout the Victorian era there. Obviously we then had the post-war urban decline, where about 38,000 people left the UK's 10 largest cities each year. But then in this century, in the 21st century, 143,000 people have moved into the UK's 10 largest cities on average per year. And probably most of that has been led by London, but then I think Birmingham and Manchester and those other big metropolitan cities will also be seeing a lot of that growth as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed putting it together and learning a little bit more about British history as I went along. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it too. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.